Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast, and the virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, which probably means that you're not. Well done you. Well, we continue with our Musical Talk virtual Edinburgh Festival Fringe for 2020, which is our attempt to try and make up in a small way for the lack of a real physical one this summer. As you probably know by now, we're trying to fill that gap by reviewing shows which you could have seen at previous Edinburgh Festival Fringes, by watching the recordings of these shows which have been placed on various virtual streaming networks like Vimeo and YouTube, and others are also available. But we're also catching up with people who have had shows on at Edinburgh in the past, and finally airing some interviews which we recorded at the time but which we've simply never had a chance to broadcast because of time constraints. The truth is, I record far too much at every Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and there is some material we just never get to broadcast. Well, we're able this year to make up for that, and that's what we're going to be doing in today's episode. We're going to be hearing an interview about a show called How to Use a Washing Machine, which was a very unusual musical for a number of reasons, and you'll get to hear why in the conversation. But that didn't stop it being, in my view, an excellent musical. It's one of those shows about which I have spent a lot of time thinking since I saw it. And it's certainly a show I would love to hear some of the score of. We don't have any songs to play for you today, but there is a medley of some of the songs from How to Use a Washing Machine online on YouTube. And perhaps you might want to go along and try that out, because it's partly because of the unusual choice to make this a string quartet musical that makes How to Use a Washing Machine such an unusual and satisfying show. So what are we going to give you today? Well, it's going to be a little bit of a broad canvas. In a few minutes you'll get to hear a conversation I recorded with the people behind the show, How to Use a Washing Machine. That's Joe Davis, the composer, and Georgie Botham, the writer, which I conducted with them at the Zoo Southside venue last year in 2019. But also, and this is something that we don't often do here on Musical Talk, you're also going to get a chance to hear two different takes in terms of reviews on the show. Because after the interview, you'll get to hear a short conversation I had with Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted composer, on what he thought about the show. And then after that, there'll be another short review, this time with Colin Malloy, another noted composer who I'm delighted reviews for Musical Talk, on the same show. So overall, you're going to get two different reviews to see how different people took it, which gives, I think, a rounder picture of how the show came across, and not just my opinion. But before that, let's hear that conversation now with the very lovely Georgie Botham and Joe Davis, a talented couple if ever there was, as we discuss their show, How to Use a Washing Machine. Musical Talk.
So our show is How to Use a Washing Machine. It's a new musical for a live string quartet. We're on at the Edinburgh Fringe for the whole month, and it was written by myself and Joe. I wrote the lyrics and the script, and Joe wrote the music.
I'm Joe Davis, and I wrote the music for How to Use a Washing Machine.
Now, this show is a new show for 2019 here at the Edinburgh Fringe, although I think it was generated a year or so ago.
Yes.
So, before we get into its history, would one or both of you like to have a stab at gently describing what it's about?
Yeah, so it's about two siblings, Cass and James, who are called home to pack up their things for the very last time, and they've taken very different paths in life, and basically as they return home and they're packing up all their old memories, they start to question whether they made the right choices and whether they should have done some things differently, and through that they really start to interrogate each other and themselves.
It's quite an introspective piece in that
Yes.
sense, isn't it? Very much so. And indeed there are several monologues. Structurally it's very interesting. There's lots of dialogue, songs of course, but there are periods, particularly at the end, where they both go off and have their stage time, shall we say, looking into themselves and their relationships with each other. And I think, and I'm sure we'll explore this, the level at which they also think about each other or other members of their family, I think is quite telling on their individual personalities. It's quite a psychological piece, I would say.
Yeah.
And that's why I responded to it so positively. I didn't necessarily always sympathise with one or other of the characters, but I understood where they were coming from, and it certainly rang true enough for me to, for this to be, I think, a perfectly intriguing investigation into individuality and duality through siblings. It's interesting that they're brother and sister. But of course it's also a musical. And I'll go for the quick heading at the beginning to say I like the score all the way through. It's a string piece, which I'd love to talk about, a string quartet, but I do think the musical choices that you've made for the excellent script are equally excellent and equally intriguing, if I may say. It's not what one might expect from a musical. In fact, one might almost go so far as to call it a chamber opera. There we are. I've flagged up what we might be talking about in the next few minutes, but let's talk first, how did it come to be, as the proud parents?
So, I mean, it began with, I was working on a production of Bernstein's Candide. I was conducting that. And
which is, let's just point out, at the opera or operetta end of musical theatre.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, I think he called it an operetta himself. So, and the original Cass and the original James for How to Use a Washing Machine were both in that production, and they said that Candide was regrettably the last show they'd ever do at Oxford because they had exams coming up and they didn't have much time after exams.
But not because they had personal beef with Leonard Bernstein.
No. They were enjoying.
I'm never doing this again.
Yeah. And I said, well, there's always chance to do a small show after your exams. You still have 4 weeks or so after. And they said, yeah, but what show can we do? There's not many shows which are very short and very easy to put on. And I said, well, why don't I write one?
I like that thinking.
Yeah. We went through a large period of time where I think they thought I was joking, but I thought they were joking when they said they'd love to do it. Eventually it turned out that none of us were joking, and Georgie was a very talented director and writer working in Oxford at the same time, and a friend of all of ours. So we roped her into it.
Yeah. I got an email one day from Amelia, who originally played Cass, saying, "Hi Georgie, I've heard you write. Would you be interested?" And then just a lot of smiley faces.
Yeah. And it just went from there, really. We had lots of writers' rooms, meetings, lots of ideas to go around. And I think it was actually fairly early we decided on a sibling thing.
Yeah.
Because I think having a two-hander of a male and female, I think the obvious thing would probably be to go love interests, rom-com.
Well done on avoiding that. Genuine, please, thank you.
And we just thought, what are relationships that are really important to us which haven't been talked about that much?
Yeah.
And the sibling relationship is very unique in that for both pairs of siblings, if anyone's lucky enough to have a sibling, you'll know the other sibling for most of your life and vice versa. You can't really say that a parent, because they'll have had all the life before you.
Which is touched upon thematically, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's quite.
So I think it's such a unique relationship. We really felt we could cover it with real interest, I think.
And certainly when you're young, as the characters are, they have made their way into the world, but they're still at the beginnings of their ultimate careers in whatever they might be. I agree with you. I think siblings, particularly, as you say, you live with them for the most part. Normally, that's the normal setup, and therefore they have this close relationship, but their lives will always branch off as well.
Exactly.
You said you're lucky to have a sibling. I do have a sibling. I'll let you know later whether that was lucky.
It's also just very interesting because obviously it's different with step siblings and with half siblings, but you are genetically very similar, and so it becomes like a real nature nurture question when you get siblings, like the characters who are so different. What is it that meant that they ended up on such different paths? That was one of the things that we really started questioning at the very start, I think, and that's what led to some of the opening songs.
So it's about a relationship first of all, and that's the moment it gelled by the sound of it. You worked out what the relationship should be and how that could then be explored through text and music. When approximately was that, would you say?
I think that was quite early on, because I can remember we established that it shouldn't be a boy meets girl, and we were talking about trying to write something that felt relevant to us but wasn't just an angsty 20-something musical. And the question that really popped up was that we wanted to ask and to answer was, what does it feel like to go home for the very last time? Particularly because, as we say, the two actors that it was originally, they had just finished uni, and so for them it kind of was that last time, and so we sort of started from there, I think. And then when was that? So we put it on in June?
June 2018, I think, well, there was a shared experience for all of us about, most people nowadays, well, it's at least becoming increasingly common that people will go to school and then go to university, but then it becomes kind of anyone's game. What do you go off and do? Do you find a job? Do you do a master's? Do you, do some qualification course? And it's a really scary kind of leap off a cliff kind of moment. So we were just talking about how could we channel that into a sibling show, really. Yeah.
And you referenced the poem, the famous poem
Yes.
about directions and not knowing the path that we'll take. Is it Robert Frost?
Robert Frost, Two Roads Diverge in a Yellow Wood.
And it's actually referenced a couple of times in the piece, so you are showing you're working. Well done.
Thank you.
But actually, and it's quite right, of course, that I ended up in my speech mark to real life. I ended up doing a career that I had no expectation that I would end up doing, and luckily loving it. But no one sits down when they're 10 and says, I'd like to be very much involved in local government governance. It's or a rocket man. Those are the options. So it gelled, but there's a big difference between having an idea and then actually manifesting in something which is written.
Yeah.
How did you develop that process? I think you said you had sort of writers' rooms.
Yeah.
And were you involved in that?
Yeah, it was.
It's important to have both strands of the creative tree in. What a terrible metaphor, but you get the idea.
No, it's true. And the actors were involved in the writing rooms as well.
So it's a proper developmental, organic process.
And we were just throwing ideas, some good, some less so, some very interesting, some very weird, and just experimented with how they could turn out, really. Yeah.
There's often a second play to be made out of offcuts, I find.
Yeah, definitely.
Not necessarily always a good play, but an interesting one. When did you feel that it sort of had actually at least reached critical mass?
I think that's difficult because I think last year we wrote it so quickly that because as we say, Joe wrote it while he was doing his final exams at uni, and I was doing it while I was doing an entirely different project and was about to start the biggest project of my life. So we were both very busy. So far.
Thank you.
So we were both incredibly busy, and we both wrote it within the space of about the vast bulk of the songs were written within the space of about 2 weeks.
And
then it was because the actual performance was then put together after the actors had finished their exams. We kind of joke that if we'd had one less day during that time, it wouldn't have got on the stage.
It was very close.
It was
very close.
So it was only, I think it was just the sheer relief of seeing it on stage for the first time and going, oh, okay.
Yeah. But it was nice to have kind of a year after. We didn't change it drastically in the year, but we made it a bit shorter because it was about an hour and 15.
Yeah.
So fringe shows are an hour. We made it a bit shorter. We changed one song. We changed bits of other songs. Yeah. Not huge changes, but we did change it.
Changed a lot of the dialogue just purely because it was very strange because of the sheer lack of time that we had the first time. I found that the first time I actually got to hear the dialogue out loud was when it was on the stage, and then I was just kind of sat there with my head in my hands going, oh no. So this is great. This is a chance to revive it the way that it should have been. So.
But did you find the removal of items, whether it be song or dialogue, has improved it? Do you fret over your babies, or do you think actually no, this is punchier, it's better, the pace keeps going? Which is not to say that the other one didn't. I never saw it, of course. But
I mean, obviously there's bits. I'm playing it every day, so there's always bits I think, oh, this maybe could have been different, this maybe could have been better. But I think generally the changes we made were for the better. There were some difficult cuts we made, and I thought, I think we'll really miss that. But I think they actually did pay off, all of them. I think some of them, we want it to be punchy. That's what a fringe musical has to be.
Yeah.
Has to be an hour of just everything that just needs to be in it.
Yeah. It was really, really hard, I think, to cut it initially because we were quite fortunate in that I think we're quite open with each other, and we'll say like, I think this bit should go, and we won't take offence to it.
Not precious.
No, exactly.
Well, that's a great thing.
But it's difficult, isn't it? Because it's a bit like I had a similar thing when I was doing my dissertation last year, where like as soon you've got to cut like 5,000 words or something, and you think, but I know what all these mean, but the person who's reading it doesn't have any idea that they're in it in the first place. So it doesn't mean anything to them, but it was just you kind of need someone else to sit next to you and go, no, honestly, get rid of it.
Definitely.
A kind of dramaturg, or at least a second voice.
Exactly.
Isn't it? Absolutely. What is your creative process? Because it's interesting that you said you were done at speed, and the problem with speed is that it doesn't always allow people to actually work in a fusion. And of course, you don't have to work in a fusion, but some people like to be in the same room or at least connected electronically. And some people say, right, I'm going to go off and write my songs, I'm going to go off and write my book, and we'll meet when I've finished in a fortnight or whenever it is. There's no right or wrong. Do you have a set way of doing it, or are you flexible?
So we got into a rhythm quite quickly. So we wrote the title song as we were kind of prepping the whole. We
Did you know it was the title song at the time?
Yeah, because I think we came up with the lyric and then we were like, oh, that could be the title. And then so that became the title song. So we wrote that initially, and then you went away and wrote some of the sections of Why Today, which is the opening song, and sent me the syllable patterns. And then, other than that, pretty much all of it was... Joe was absolutely amazing. I couldn't have asked for a better writing partner, because every single time I would just write the lyrics and he'd say, just send them to me, it's going to be fine. And I'd be like, no, it's awful. And he'd just sit down, he'd just make them into something beautiful. So
did you
brilliant.
set them, or did you also tweak them?
Mostly I set them. I really like the challenge of...
This is Gilbert and Sullivan, by the way. They did all right.
Yeah. I really like the challenge of not tweaking them and not making them into perfect rhyming syntax. I like the unpredictability of words and phrases that are uneven. So
Conversational.
Yeah. So I like setting them like that. I did tweak a bit, and I added a couple of my own lines. There's a line about a banker which goes...
with a missing last word, I think.
Yeah, with a missing last word, which I won't say on the podcast, but it goes...
I'd be amazed if anyone didn't know what
I've decided to become a banker. There's a reason why it rhymes with, and then there's a big dissonant chord.
And every single time, that either gets a laugh or it doesn't. And every single time, Joe and I lock eyes. And if it's got a laugh, he like looks at me and goes like, ha ha. And if it doesn't, I just like smirk and just go, well.
You may be interested to know, by the way, that is a problem that goes back all the way back to the Gershwins. There's a song where it's a more traditional 1930 song, but it's called "Oh, What Love Has Done to Me," and it's sung by the woman Ella Fitzgerald does, I think, the best version of it. But you don't. It's quite a rare song, but she's singing about how it's one of those traditional songs. I'm in love with a terrible man, but I'm not going to leave him, kind of thing. There's a squillion of them, but it's a great song in its own right. But she's talking about what she might have had, and a rhyme has to be found for banker. Now, I have no doubt that the other word that we're all thinking of probably wasn't 1930s American slang currency. Yeah. But the way they have to find a negative term to rhyme with banker, and they end up with tanker, meaning in the sense of lumbering, heavy, and unmovable. Yeah. But, I think yours, at least imagined, has greater fluency than the Gershwins. And you can't get better than that. So that's very interesting. But can I just explore that a little bit? Because it's interesting because if you were talking about, you as the writer drew from the syllable base, the scansion, I suppose, in the sense, or you were given the rhythm to work to.
Just for the first song, yeah.
Oh, I see, right. But I suppose what I wanted to explore a little bit was the form of lyrics when they're set. Yeah. Because let's talk Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert was actually at heart a light verse writer, a versifier. Yours is much more modern. A lot of the conversation in the lyrics are flowing in the song, so it's not da 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 boom, da 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 rhyming boom. It's actually, let's hear conversational scansion, conversational rhythms, conversational up and down. So actually, I suppose I'm trying to say, is a writer of dialogue in this context a better lyricist than a versifier? Discuss.
30 marks.
Yeah. Show your work.
I don't know. I think it definitely gives this piece a very distinctive voice. Like, for example, I think the song for me that it stands out the most in is Cass has a song towards the end called Pipe Dream. And I can remember at that point, which stands very differently to Calculated Cliché, which is James's song just before, where that feels the most musical theatre to me. That was the one where, it's a lot, the rhyme scheme's a lot stricter, there's a lot stricter rhythm. And so then we wrote that, and then afterwards I knew what I wanted the song to be. I didn't know how to say it, or I knew how to say it, but I didn't know how to make it into a song. And we were kind of having this conversation over like Facebook Messenger, and I was going, Joe, what do I do? And he just said, just write what you want and I'll make it into a song. And so I just thought, oh, it's fine, I'll just send it and he'll make it sound better. But actually it turned into a song from what I'd written exactly, and it's my favourite song in the show, hands down.
That's quite interesting, and I like the fact you've also drawn the difference in the style of the two songs for those two characters, which also reflect those two characters, because the brother in this is much more traditional, I think, upright, fits into a more traditional, conventional box if you're putting people into labels, and you can't put people into labels, but you'll work with me here, but you get the idea. But whereas Cass is more artistic and bohemian, I suppose, in the old-fashioned sense. Yeah, exactly. So it would be entirely appropriate that they would have different styles of song to underscore and elaborate upon their large solo monologues at the end. Yeah, I'm talking nonsense today. Of course monologues are solo. Please treat me like the fool I am. I want to come on to the psychology of the characters in a minute, but at the moment I still want to stay with the music, if I may. Did you always envisage it as a string quartet?
From the beginning, actually, yeah.
And that's an interesting choice in itself. Why? And don't just say because I play the cello.
Well, partially because of that, because I've played lots of different kinds of string quartets, and I'm always amazed at the range of sounds you can get with four quite similar instruments. They can do so much. They can pizzicato, they can hit the strings, they can bow, they can play legato, staccato, whatever.
Well, can I just briefly interrupt and say, in the washing machine song itself, you do two fantastically, what might be called non-musical, but of course they are musical things. You portray a cat and you portray a washing machine going wrong with your cello.
Yeah.
I think you've proven to me that your versatility and the versatility of the instrument is very impressive.
Yeah. And I just thought there's a lot of musicals which do use strings, not quite a string quartet, but they use strings, and they use the strings in actually a very simple way. It's just maybe to sustain chords, or
sometimes it's just a bed of lushness as well, which is all very well, but it just it feels like a bed and we all fall asleep.
And I just thought
this isn't that at all.
Yeah, and I just thought maybe if we just take away everything else and we just have strings, no piano, no percussion, no guitar, let's not make it easy for ourselves and have the string quartet and just experiment with what they could do. It could be a really interesting start for a score. So that was the beginning of it, really, actually, very early on.
How would you describe your score? Or how would you both describe your score?
You can answer first. I'm not a musician.
I've tried to make it as eclectic as possible. I've actually mostly tried to use styles which string quartets don't normally play, actually. So, like Calculated Cliché has what you might describe as a bass drop. So whether you embody that with kind of house music, but then also the music of Arturo Piazzolla, who was a South American tango composer.
Thank you for the explanation, because I was lost.
Who created these hugely exciting and unique tangos. So I use that in How to Use a Washing Machine. That's effectively a tango. So I just use those styles and use styles which the string quartet don't really get to play, and I just thought, what if we put those together, what will happen?
Well, there's a real sense of vibrancy, I think, from the orchestra.
Definitely.
And that, I think, keeps an audience on its toes as well. I think it's one of the very essential ingredients of the success of the show. I'm fascinated by the characters, and I'm fascinated by the music that the characters are using to express themselves, because what it isn't is obvious. And it's that, when I say failure to be obviousness, which is the great success, and what a sense that is, but it is that, I think, you're right, you could have done it in a way that we might have expected, or a bit more traditional musical, but actually the very fact is complicated and intriguing, and I think as an audience you have to sort of make at least some effort to engage, and I think that's always to be encouraged. You can't just lie back and let the music or the piece come upon you. You have to sort of, you definitely have to engage with it, and that, I think, is clear the moment the first piece of music starts. Was there anything that you therefore missed, that you, having made your decision, like having laid in your bed, as it were, did you then think, oh no, I really want a saxophone in the middle of this one?
I think,
where's my glockenspiel?
Yeah, I think there were times when I missed percussive instruments. Not necessarily a full array, but there were times when I just thought, could we just have a bit more rhythm? Could we just have a bit more, percussive sounds? But then I just thought, well, actually, strings can do that in their own special way. I mean, pizzicato is really a percussive effect. There's hitting the strings at points. They can be percussive instruments as well. So I thought, let's just replace that with the strings. Is
it William Balkan who bashes the side of his piano when he's playing?
Yeah.
Well, you're right. You can make rhythm out of a lot of things that you wouldn't expect. Absolutely. I think the score is very impressive, and I do like the differences in the song. So it's also nicely different throughout. It's not, I've got this now, this is whatever it is, because it isn't. The next song is different again, the next song is different again. And the most essential thing, it underscores or underplays or helps bed and move on the emotional moments of the play. So how did you come to the point where you knew songs had to be? How did you find between you your nexus points?
That's a good question. I think we quite early on laid down the structure of the show, because I am very interested in the way that time relates to shows. I think that's partially visible through the references to the parents and to the two roads and that kind of thing. So I really wanted to get the structure laid out first. So we kind of sat down and we went, right, so we'll have a duet here, we'll have a solo song here, and it did change. But I think because we had that really strong starting point, it meant that we weren't kind of floundering. I felt like we were quite secure from the offset, which was really nice.
And did anything move as it developed?
There was no big shuffle, was there?
No big shuffle. No. The only significant change, I think, has been in the change between the two shows. We replaced one of the songs.
Yeah.
It's a very, very different tone.
Is it Rouge France? Which one?
No. It's called. It's the song You Knew, which happens after the point where they both find out that the other knew about their parents' divorce. Their parents are getting divorced, but both thought only they knew and the other didn't.
Yeah.
But now they found that both
Secrets.
of them knew. Yeah. And originally it was kind of more of a melancholic, Threnody-like song.
Yeah.
But we thought, actually, if your siblings had that revelation, it wouldn't be a sad moment. It would be an angry moment. It would be an argument. So it was a change, really. And actually, the emotions in that song now, there's a lot of emotions in that song, and they're very frequent and they're very quick, and it's very turning and it's very atmospheric. So that was something that had to change, I think.
I think it's definitely created a different tone with it, and I think it really helped. And I think it's at least partially because, you know, as we've already discussed, it's not a boy meets girl story.
No.
And I think it's important that then the argument doesn't feel like it's a boy meets girl, oh, what have you done to me, kind of thing. It's more like you're being a a word.
You banker. Well, I think that's a very handy jumping off point to talk to us a bit more about the characters in it. Now, we have a brother and a sister.
We do.
Who have very different characters. We've already said that one has become quite conventional, partly because he feels he has to be. And you can see that there is that relationship between the brother and the sister where they are partially defined by the other one. So it seems to me. I will say that Cass seems to be the more damaged of the two, if I may be so bold, and therefore, the word volatile is used in the piece. And there's the thing I found most fascinating about the psychology here is the fact that, and contextually and specifically, it is very easy in a familial circumstance to feel infantilized. And a lot of us feel or felt that way in those years after leaving home, whether to go to university or whatever it is, because Christmas is the big thing that comes around every year, and the tradition still is people go back to the home for Christmas or whatever it is. And it's very easy to fall back into the relationships which were valid when you left or beforehand. And I think parents sometimes do it with their children. And I think children sometimes allow themselves to get into that because they haven't yet formed a new relationship with their parents. The same thing is also with their siblings. You can have a squabbly relationship with your siblings. You can both go on to become High Court judges, and yet you come home and squabble. What an interesting family that would be. But so that's the contextual thing. We know that from our own experiences. I think most people would have at least some understanding of that, whether they've experienced it or seen it. But Cass has it seems to me, a fear of change, and that's overtly stated again. So she has, but she also doesn't want to be seen as a child. So she herself infantilizes her brother. It seems she brings him back down to the level that they were at, and then she complains when he then treats her in the way that they did, and that in some sense seems to me to be the driving dynamic force of their emotional relationship for much of the rest of the play. There's obviously a lot more there, but that seems to be the ultimate fracture in the mutuality of their psychology, if you don't mind me getting a bit poncy for a second.
No, it's a good phrase.
Discuss. Did you recognise that?
Yes, absolutely. I think when we revisited it this year, the kind of thing that we really wanted to go with, and I can remember sitting down with our producer Christina and saying the difference between them that I really, really want to emphasise is if you had a family function, James would go in and he'd wow everybody. Everyone would love him. They'd be, oh, what a nice young man, that kind of thing. Cass would go in and would rub everyone up the wrong way, but she wouldn't mean to. And I think that was the starting point, and it meant that they both have to own that from very early on. I think it's really interesting the way that the dynamic, particularly with the volatile thing, plays into it, because the problem partially seems to be that James is wanting to protect her, and she claims that she doesn't need protecting, but then does what he says she will anyway, and you kind of end up with this weird cycle of trying to second guess other people and second guess yourself. And I think that's one of the things that I think the show kind of touches on, is that you can not just talking to other people about things and not just assuming that you know what they're thinking, but also trying to talk to yourself about it sometimes, and not just assuming that you've got to stick to one thing or one idea. And people are layered, and they're not just he's not just a boring banker. He's much more layered than that.
Well, I've always seen from the start of it actually that you meet these two characters and it's immediately apparent that Cass is having problems and James isn't. But then as the show goes on, it kind of it becomes really apparent that they are actually both having as many problems as each other.
You're certainly not content.
Yeah, no. Yeah, definitely, yeah. And it just goes to show that it's a reading for people in their young 20s that, though they seemingly might be happy, actually beneath the surface, they are having big problems of their own.
Yeah, particularly because I think, I know it's a cliche by this point, but we very much have the whole kind of highlight reel culture of Instagram and that kind of thing, where you put your best foot forward all the time.
Yeah.
And you kind of see that, I think, in the first scene, when James comes home and he's like, oh, I've got promotion, I've got a nice new flat, and then he turns around and she's just kind of sat with a cup of tea being like, great.
Yeah. And then you find out, but personally he's not had a girlfriend in years, and that would perhaps make him happier.
Yeah, and he doesn't really seem to connect with anybody, and he doesn't enjoy his job, and so all this kind of facade that he puts on isn't all it seems.
Even the throwaways are nice there, because the only reference to friends we get is to the boys.
The boys, yeah.
There's no specific friend either.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's easy to be part of a group, but it doesn't give you much.
It's also quite a lad culture thing. In it's really easy just to be like, oh, the lads, the boys, and I think that's probably something.
Guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's something that James has got sucked into, is just
definitely.
being with a group of friends because that's what he's been told he should do. That's what he's been raised to think should happen, rather than actually, being a bit more introspective and thinking, do I actually like these people?
Yeah, well, I've got a friend, as it happens, who has spent quite a lot of it. He's in his 20s, and it's very clear to me, I've only known him in the last few years, used to work with him, and he makes his social connections through groups, because then you don't have to do one-on-one, and you can also slip away without the group. There's no responsibility attached to that, because he can then leave before the rest of the group has gone, and it won't matter. So he uses it as slipping off. So actually, that's social avoidance through social engagement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which I find absolutely fascinating. It's very interesting you say that, because obviously Cass also has a fairly feeble social life. What we get to see is that actually she really likes living on her own, because there's a character, Stephanie, I think, who steals her milk, but there's it's a real suggestion that actually they were not compatible as flatmates.
Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing, and one imagines if it's all Stephanie's fault.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
Yes. Having seen Cass in action, but that I found fabulous and fascinating. And even at the end, when they sort of do their introspection through their monologues and then come back and touch base and try privately to find, at least apologise to each other.
Yeah.
Although with the proviso of not telling anyone else, so it's all very usually. It's interesting because every now and then there's background noise of parents arguing or whatever's going on in the background of the house, but we never see the parents.
No.
And they're sort of phantoms at the feast in a way, because particularly the father, I think, because he seems to get referenced a lot in their thoughts. The mother much more invisible. I don't want to draw too much into that, but
I think the mother is much more in Why Today is the voice that they is the kind of the typical parent, like, oh, brush your hair, why aren't you doing this, why aren't you doing that, and then Cass seems to talk about the father a lot more. I think
he seems to have been complicit in a way, doesn't he?
Yeah. I think that's one of the differences that we drew on during the rehearsal process, was which parent does your character identify with more, whose side would they take in the divorce. And then that really kind of exposed quite a lot about the characters. I think that they were stood on the other end of the room going, no, obviously mum's right, and then no, dad, what are you on about? She's horrible, And so I think it was really interesting, particularly because I think one of the things that I like about this show is the bit towards the end where Cass, her dad walks past singing, and she thinks about, I never really realised that you had a life before me. And it's that realisation that I think we all have at some point, where you go, oh, my parent is a person. They don't just exist to be a parent, they're also a person. And I think that's a realisation that we all have, and I think particularly it gets amplified when you go off to university and come back and they've been doing stuff without you, and you're like, oh, but I've not been here, why have you been going away?
Or decorated your room, so you are the one who left.
Exactly.
Gosh, all coming back to me now. And I would like briefly then to talk about and it's such a short thing, but I think it works so effectively, the end. Which is a musical ending, not a song. Are you happy to mention what that is? Because it's more than, it seems to act more than punctuation. It has a very odd effect, and I'm actually having a little bit of trouble sort of grasping why it was so successful.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting, the relationship between the quartet and the actors on stage, even just from the fact, the quartet take up a quarter of the stage.
Yes.
So there's
a quartet.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, mathematically, it's beautiful.
So there's very much a level of, they are really part of the story, and they come to, I think, in musicals they're most music is most effective when music speaks where words can't.
Yeah, definitely.
And so at the end particularly, it ends with them kind of rolling their eyes at each other, and just that final chord is like a kind of ceiling, like we're done now. I think particularly because the argument itself is the reconciliation itself is quite funny, but I think quite realistic, and that neither of them really properly apologise. They just kind of come back and they're like, oh, sorry, even though they both said horrible things, and neither of them apologised for them. But that's, in my mind, that's what happens with most of my siblings. You don't actually apologise properly. You just go like, should we just put a lid on it and leave?
A form of reconciliation without,
exactly. Yeah. So I think that kind of that chord at the end for me just really kind of like solidifies. It's like moving on now.
Well, I was just going to say about the changes that would happen after the show.
Yeah.
I always see it, I don't know what you ever thought, but I always thought James continues with his job, but perhaps takes up some amateur ballet or watches ballet a bit more.
His work-life balance will change.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Cass continues pursuing art, but perhaps gets a more stable-ish job part-time. Perhaps she teaches art, but they don't live with each other now, but they perhaps talk on the phone once a week now.
Yeah.
It's not huge changes, but it's a little things that have changed.
Yeah.
And I think that's indicative of what a sibling makeup might be.
Yeah, exactly. I think, neither of them properly realised they needed to change until the other one kind of whipped them into shape, and then that final moment is time to move on.
Yeah.
You see, for me, that final, and it's so short, but it's so right. That little chord isn't a full stop. To me, it's a dash.
Yeah.
And that suggests there's more, by the way.
Yeah.
Now that's up to you.
Well, it's a snippet of it. It's a day in the life of Cass and James.
Exactly.
We start in the morning, we end in the evening, and it's just this is an interesting day, but that's it. It's up to you what happens next.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that actually Cass isn't told off for ruining a washing machine because they're expensive items.
They are very expensive.
Now, how can people contact you? Tell me more about your group and what are your contact details if people would like to contact you about the show.
Great. So we are Slam Theatre. That's Slam all in capitals. And we're available. We have a website which is slamtheatre.com. Where if you want more of the contact details, they're all on there. We also have email addresses like contact@slamtheatre, where you can ask to get in contact with any of us. We can reply with a personal email. It's just easiest for that to be like the centralised.
That's your focal point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We also have Twitter and Instagram. We don't have Tinder or Bebo, but we could get them. So that's the main place. Our website, slamtheatre.com.
I think it would be a very odd world where people try to make contact about musical theatre through Tinder.
Oh, I think we should give it a try.
Musical theatre Tinder. Well, I will avoid the obvious joke, I think. And finally then, after Edinburgh, what more for the show? Is there more for the show? What would you like?
I'd like there to be a live. I think there definitely is much more to come from our composing lyricist partnership.
I was rather hoping there'd be a part B.
Yes, there is.
I think there'll definitely
Should we put a chord in that sounds like a dash?
Yes.
I think there'll be more shows, and I think this show, though it won't be our immediate next thing we do to resurrect this show, it will at some point down the line come back.
Yeah, we've started discussing what the next project is, and potentially the one after that.
How to mend the washing machine.
Basically, yeah.
Well, it's been such a faff taking a washing machine on tour with us.
I looked at that prop and I thought that is trouble.
Yeah, particularly because poor producer and our technical director Will and Christina, they had to gut the entire thing because washing machines are heavy. They have 4 concrete blocks in them, and that's not even including all the interior bits. So
it's just something dancing around the floor when you're having your spin, isn't it?
Yeah. So they had to, really take it to bits. And then there was one point when we had a tour before this. We went to Oxford, London, and Manchester. And there was a point in Manchester where one of the sides of the washing machine just came away a bit, and everyone just froze, and we were like, we can't rename the show. What do we do?
But we'd love it to be. This is George's joke, not mine. But we'd love it to be how to use a toaster, and then of course it would be far more portable.
So much more portable.
Hair tongs. So there is a possibility that this show will have a further life.
Yes.
There's certainly a possibility of your working career to have a second show and more, hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, I think this show is a fabulous show. I very, very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I would recommend it to anyone. So please do stay in touch. But thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the tea.
Full-style cabaret jazz bar, 7 o'clock.
Musical talk. And the third show we're going to be talking about today, very different in style, very different in tone, completely contemporary. How to use a washing machine. A sort of oddly pathetic title for ultimately an investigation into the relationship of two siblings going back to their family house for what they expect to be the last time to pack up their childhood belongings, because their parents are getting a divorce and the implication is that they're moving out of the house, and so it's the last time. The parents are never seen. They're heard occasionally in the background. I thought that was a very nice way of letting you know that the house environment was a lived-in one, so it made it less sterile. And then we have a brother and sister who have their own personalities and their own problems, both contemporary problems in their own lives and with each other's relationship now, and their historic relationship, all of which gets churned up in a big melee of emotion as part of a string quartet musical, which I thought was astounding. I was very impressed by it. I liked it a great deal. I found the musical soundscape fabulous, actually. I thought the use of 4 string instruments to give it a tone and a feel and a flavour which I wasn't expecting, making it a sort of little chamber musical, really, I think, and suitably intimate in feel to match the emotional introversion that we were being offered up, because the characters displayed their emotion both in their interactions with each other but also then in sizable monologues towards the end where they were on their own, obviously, musing on their circumstances. I hope that's a fairish description of the piece as I see it, but I may have missed subtleties, which you've seen, Mike. So
I agree. I think the string quartet was a fresh and novel choice for the instrumentation. I think a contemporary show with a lot of psychological action and introspection and personal relationships and angst would more commonly be served by a band, a pop band of some kind, or a solo piano, and the quartet was just such an interesting choice. The composer knew how to write for strings. The writing was very idiomatic. There were a lot of great uses of string techniques. There was even a really funny moment where I think there was a joke about abusing a cat or putting a cat in a microwave, not in a mean-spirited way, just in the spirit of, I think I accidentally microwaved the cat or something like that.
It wasn't quite as horrific, but a cat was teased as a child. Yes.
Right, and the details don't matter in this case. And then there was a little bit of a high gliss, I think, on the cello that was mimetic of a cat meowing. Yeah. So there was, and that was just a string effect. So
also, when the washing machine goes wrong.
Was there something there?
Yes, there was a little bit of work on the, I don't know what you would call it, the fretboard, but it made it sound, there was something that made it sound a little bit like mechanical failure, at least to my ear.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't notice that. But generally, I really liked that color choice, and it gave the show a kind of musical signature and a distinct identity. It wasn't a gimmick. It really felt like it was part of the texture of the story.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because my prejudice, or at least my shorthand, would be, it's interesting you spoke about how a band might often be used in that circumstance, but that's, I think, if you're trying to go for what might be called the soul or the emotional, the unsubtle emotion of a character, I think can be portrayed better that way. I think naturally, I assume when I hear a string quartet, I sort of think of sort of pizzicato moments. For some reason or other, it seems to me a much more inward-looking sound, a much more inward-looking representation that you get from it. And so actually it seems to be very good for introspection. It seems to have that odd mixture of the small emotion, and it's the small emotions we're talking about here. They make big emotions when cumulatively put together. But there's a little bit of pain here, and a little cut there, and a snub here, and an upset there, and you put them together and you get the tumult of an emotional breakdown or whatever. But actually it seems to me that strings help you put those things together. It's just more intricate, I think, is the word I'm looking for. And it was an intricate piece with an intricate quartet. And I think that's, for me, how those two things merge so successfully.
It's worth mentioning that the music is often very rhythmic and very agitated in a way that I think reflects the emotions of the characters. This isn't a lot of sob story, long legato lines. Yeah. It really was a lot of jagged rhythms and motoric sounds. I would almost say it's derived from minimalism, not in the sense of repetition, a lot of repetition, though there was some of that, but just in the sense of this motoric drive, like a John Adams or Philip Glass kind of approach to the music, on top of which the vocal melodies were a little more fluid and legato. and they gave the story a kind of impulse, because as the story begins, the two siblings are struggling with public transportation and trying to get home for the holidays, and I think it's snowing and there's delays, and as I understand, in the UK it is not unheard of for a train to be late. And
it's not unheard of. I believe it's compulsory.
So there's this sense of, oh gosh, I got to get home. I'm stressed out. And the music reflects that very well. There's a kind of fragmentation of a phrase. I think it's "Why today" lyrically.
Yes.
And it does convey the sense of anxiety in a way that's both musically pleasing, but that kind of clicks rhythmically.
Narratively, it also works because that "Why Today" song, as you say, is their opening number, and they're both being wrenched from their speech marks' real lives, and their real lives are very clearly isolated, and so they are not just unhappy about the fact that they're being dragged back to their family home for one last time. There's also a sense that the barriers that have been erected between them as a family, not just the brother and sister, but with the parents, one imagines, are having to be breached because of something. To me, I got a very strong sense of reluctance because of the event, but also because of the emotions that were almost expected to happen. The thing I found most fascinating for me in the book, however, was the use of infantilization. The sister is more damaged than the brother. The brother had unusual interests. When he was a boy, he wanted to become a ballerina. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a little unusual. His sister saw herself as artistic and has not been successful. She's also much more emotionally volatile, I think that would be fair to say. The brother has thrown away his ambitions and has become something very stolid, solid, dependable, but possibly dull. And when they meet, she chastises him for having changed. And then, she wants, in a way, she seems to be arguing that he should be the person that he was when he was younger. It turns out she's very conservative for an artistic person. She doesn't actually like any change. She doesn't seem to be able to cope with it.
Interesting point.
But she then infantilizes him. So they revert back to their childhood relationship because she acts like a child and brings on his childish responses. And then when he treats her as the older brother, which is the infantilized response to how they used to be, she then criticized him for treating her like an infant. As far as I was concerned, I found her harder to like or respond to because she was, it's a terrible thing to say, because she was more damaged. But that damage came out in more spiteful behaviour, more volatile behaviour. It didn't seem to me that he had done anything particularly wrong with his life, or indeed particularly wrong with her. She would poke him with a stick, essentially, and then when he reacted, she would criticise him. And I found, having been a sibling as a child, I'm still one now, incidentally, but obviously the circumstances are different. There was enough in that, particularly as I was the older brother, to remind me of my own childhood in some senses, perhaps not as acutely, but I was interested in the circularity of infantilism.
I see more parallelism between the two than perhaps you do. In that Cass, the artistic free spirit who's living the bohemian life of lots of roommates and not
actually enjoying it.
Exactly. She is she's kind of coming from a childish perspective. She's early 20s, and as you say, she's more damaged and on a very unpredictable life trajectory at the moment. Her brother, on the other hand, is also, as you said, more in a solid, predictable, entrenched field with a clear future ahead of him. I think he's a banker or something like that.
Something financial, wasn't it?
She is struggling with the realities of the world and the need to get by in the world. He, I think, has found a way to get by in the world, but he's struggling with his own discontent because he's really left behind his artistic his creative life is left behind.
His work-life balance is very bad. We get the impression he works very, very hard, almost to the exclusion of other things. There's some sense that he hasn't actually got a wide circle of friends anymore, and when he does, they're the boys. He got criticised for calling his sort of gang of mates the boys, and he meets them down the pub, which he hasn't done for a long time. And there's also a sense that he hasn't got any close, intimate friends, certainly no girlfriend. So yes, I agree with that he has a more overtly successful life.
So I think we have
with problems.
Two people trying to find their way in life. One is focusing way too much, almost exclusively on his career and in a very dependable world. The other of whom is neglecting the element of cultivating stability in your life. And she's all ego and no id, and she's trying to be a painter and doesn't seem to have a coherent plan. So they've both drifted in opposite directions, and each prompts the other to reevaluate the course of their life and to really consider a course change. And this manifests first in what seems like the kind of teasing, poking fun at and needling that you'd expect from siblings, and evolves into much more serious mutual critique, which in turn prompts a lot of reflection, and the implication being perhaps some change of life direction. And that is the real arc of the story. It's the two siblings helping one another, seemingly through an adversarial confrontation.
Yes, it's the positive outcome of an antagonistic relationship, isn't it? It is exactly that, but I would describe it slightly more as a nudge in the right direction. I don't think it wasn't a simplistic, I thought about what my sibling has said and they are right, therefore I'm now going to change my life. It was, there may be something in what they said. I'm reluctantly going to have to take on board some of their comments. They are fair.
The beginning of progress.
Yes, exactly. There's a kind of rapprochement towards the end, which ultimately always happens with siblings, certainly in a childhood environment, because you live with them. You have to sort of come to some conclusion. You can't walk out forever. But it wasn't, my life is going to be completely changed. I think it was actually the balance has shifted in both their own lives and in their relationship. But they're a very odd, well, no, not very odd. I think in the sense, actually, they may be surprisingly common. One gets the impression that there's love between them, but they don't much like each other as siblings.
I disagree.
Oh, right, go on.
Yeah, no, I think that they are immensely fond of each other. No, I think there's true fondness crystallized from childhood, and there's some frustration because each sees the other going in the wrong way. And perhaps they don't have the skill set to present that concern in a mature fashion, so it manifests in squabbling and disappointment, and you're not who I remembered, et cetera, et cetera. But, and I also think it's fueled by a lot of self-criticism. As each is lashing out at the other, I think they're also feeling the weight of their own disappointment and perhaps the mounting sense of, I really need to rethink of my own life. But I think there's real love between the two characters that's just been clouded by conflict and fear about their own worlds.
But you can love someone or not like them.
But there's so much fondness. But you
think so?
In describing this musical, we've made it sound a lot more grim than it actually is.
Yes, and it's not at all, no.
It is joyous, it is fun, it is witty, it is full of particulars that are very vivid and true to life. There's, particularly in the opening, there's just a lot of fun. There's a lot of wit and banter. So you couldn't have had that atmosphere in the show if the two characters didn't like each other.
You see, because the reason I still hold to my particular view is that I got the impression that, I certainly didn't get the impression that once the family house had broken up, the brother and sister would see very much more of each other. And we'd already had a sense of drifting apart quite considerably when it was a little throwaway, wasn't it? But the brother didn't go to their last Christmas, ostensibly because he was too busy. But, that's a big statement, not going to your family Christmas. But maybe we're seeing this through the prism of our own family relationships. I don't know.
Could well be. I saw this as the instigation of healing that will continue in their future. Perhaps not in the case of the parents, but in the case of the siblings.
But healing in the sense of their relationship with each other or their own individual way of living.
I would say both.
Oh, you see, that's interesting.
I don't see them as drifting apart forever from this moment.
I saw much more change in themselves and much less change in their relationship with each other. But because I found it, I didn't see them escaping that. I thought that the changes which they had been generated in each other were the things they were doing in their separate lives, not in their shared lives, and therefore that's where I saw the greater effect. But then again, I suspect that this is the nature of a good piece, that actually we're able to have this slightly different interpretation. And it is only a slight difference, because we both thought it was good, we both thought it was interesting, and we both think that the central thrust is there. It's always an interesting game, I think, to wonder what the sequel to any given piece of drama might be. And I think rarely would people have the same view.
Now, have you already interviewed the creators of this show?
Yes, I've had the great pleasure of meeting them both, the writer and the composer.
Did they weigh in on this subject of debate that we are now having?
No, I didn't touch on this, actually, funnily enough. So I have no way of giving you an authoritative answer on as to which of us might be correct or whether we're both wrong.
Right. There might be a boiler explosion in the next scene after the show is over, and perhaps they're all dead.
Well, I don't like your sequel at all. musical talk. Because it's rare, I like non-romantic central relationships in musicals because you don't see them very often.
Sure.
And it wasn't the only musical that did that in the sense of having a non-romantic central male-female couple at its heart in Edinburgh that we both saw, although not together. Yeah. There was another show called How to Use a Washing Machine, which, for me, the central conceit was the interrelationship between a brother and sister, a fairly estranged brother and sister, I should say, who are going back to the family house for the last time because their parents are divorcing and they've been summoned to collect and wrap up their childhood belongings, pending the last ever time the family will be in that particular dynamic and geographical environment. And of course what this plays in, which is something I think a lot of us have experienced upon revisiting our families after moving out, of returning to the relationships of when you were small. You know, the mother-father, brother-sister relationship in this case reasserts itself quite quickly. You don't see the parents, which actually I think is quite a nice conceit, so it's all about the brother and the sister. There are noises in the background, which are the parents, but the brother and the sister are the only characters you see. Obviously not a romantic relationship, which is our segue from the last show. That would have been a dark path if it had been, by the way. But their relationship is about infantilizing each other, and for me, the sister doesn't like... She wants the security of her childhood, and so she doesn't like the fact her brother is moving on in the world, even though it's in an area that she doesn't like. She doesn't like the fact he's given up his dreams to become an accountant, essentially. So she infantilizes him back into his childhood relationships in order to try and, well, I think partly to give herself a feeling of comfort, but also to try and, I think, rather ineptly shake him out of his conventionality. But of course, in being infantilized, he then treats her as their relationship would demand when they were children, and treats her as an infant, and she resents it very strongly. So she's sort of, she then rails and rants against him. I found that central psychological relationship very interesting and, for me, truthful in the sense that I know a lot of people who have been in that situation. On a personal level, I'm quite pleased to say that it happened for a while, but my family were able to move on. And I now have fully adult relationship with my parents and vice versa, but I know a lot of people who don't, and you see it. You perhaps visit them when their parents are visiting and suddenly they're 12 again. It's quite remarkable. That I've rambled on tremendously on that. I just wondered if...
Well, and very astutely, I find the it did have that petty sibling rivalry which almost gave way to them giving each other wanting the upper hand over one another, which then gave way to these kind of big rhapsodic moments where they were being psychologically introvert and reflecting on their past.
There was, I thought, an idiosyncratic nature to the structure of the piece as well, because actually, for all intents and purposes, the first 5 and 10 minutes are watching the anxiety of the brother and sister separately making their way to the house.
That's true.
The next half an hour is their interrelationships mostly, and how they squabble and get on each other's nerves, and how it doesn't go tremendously well. But then, very oddly, there is a 5-minute monologue from the brother on his own on the stage, giving you insight into his feeling, followed by a 5-minute monologue by the sister giving you her feelings, and then a final, if you like, I won't say denouement, but a coming together, where you get a sense of perhaps some peace has been found. I personally didn't buy it for the longer term. I rather thought it was for the purposes of that visit for that day or weekend. They had found a way of not squabbling. I still didn't get the impression that the relationship would be repaired once they travelled back to wherever it was they were living in different parts of the country.
That's kind of human relationships in a nutshell, though, anyway.
Isn't it just, yeah? How can we tidy this up for now?
Yeah.
But that structurally is very interesting, to give two people monologues and time for monologues at the end of what is only an hour is actually quite a bold choice of writing, direction and timing.
Yeah, I guess it has a feel that's more similar to, say, a concert work where you have almost two soloists, and I know you were going to touch upon the music, but the fact that it was performed by a string quartet rather than, say, a band of the more obvious configuration, or just a piano, or even just backing tracks. It felt more like we were watching a concert piece with two soloists and watching that almost performer back and forth. And it felt like the piece had also been written in a way, for better or worse, but in a clever way where it was showcasing each performer via the character, or vice versa, I don't know.
You see, that's very interesting. Yes, you're quite right about it having a very particular feel as a result of its choice of instrumentation as well. I mean, it was the only string quartet musical I saw in Edinburgh this year. I can tell you it's probably the only string quartet musical I've seen for a few years. I've seen one or two.
Before? Okay.
I have, but not many.
Okay.
Was it a good idea? Did it work within the story for you? Would you have done it differently? What does string bring? There we are.
Bless you. I think actually it's a sound that isn't exploited enough. Writing string quartet sound, in my experience, is quite difficult. And I think the composer did well, but they are playing constantly, so it's a beast of a show. And I saw them, I was sat right by them, so I saw what they were playing whilst they were playing, and they were playing endlessly throughout that without much stop. So I think it's something that perhaps needs more polish, but as an idea I think it's great to have a string quartet. I think if you're orchestrating something, I personally feel you have to be a bit more sensitive to what am I bringing with these instruments. Piano is a kind of an orchestra in a box, so it has that pro to it, but string quartet, sure, they sound great, but could they be a metaphor for the kind of nuclear family? You've got 4 instruments.
Oh gosh, yes.
So you've got mum, dad, and you've got the 2 siblings. So maybe it's that kind of harmony between the 4 instruments that it's trying to play off. I don't know.
That is an amazing observation, which have completely failed me. I was going to make an observation in a slightly different direction, which is I think that a more conventional band of whatever makeup, but certainly piano, drums, guitar, whatever, the kind of thing you'd expect to see, gives you brash emotion. When I think you get with and this may just be my prejudice, but when I think is conjured up for me with string instruments, and therefore a string quartet can only give you this feeling, is psychology. Ironically, being highly strung, as the daughter in particular is, but there is a sense of being able to play. You know, there's a wealth of sounds you can get out of it's easy to say, I've got a lot of string instruments, what I've now got is a romantic lush bed. There wasn't any of that. It wasn't orchestral in that sense. What it was chamber, in the sense of, each individual instrument had its voice, had its sound. You can pull out very high notes, they're agitated, you can get pizzicato, which is a very odd form of speech marks percussion, if you like. I think that what you can hear is the strain. I think it represents strains and anxieties in people's psychology and psyche, particularly in an antagonistic environment in which they were finding themselves in. So what it didn't do was conjure up nostalgia of the house, but I don't think we were getting much nostalgia. I think we were getting the relationship between the central characters was in the here and now, flavoured by nostalgia, flavoured by the nostalgic context, but actually, whilst backward looking, was a contemporary event, and the music for me represented that contemporary event rather than the context in which the contemporary event was taking place. I may have spoken a great deal of nonsense there.
I don't think so.
But that's how it felt.
I mean, in the history of the string quartet is an avid... Well, it's the whole 18th century, the concertgoer wanting to be able to bring the music into their living room.
Of course, so portable.
Then the composer would write string quartets for rich benefactors they knew, who would then bring around their violinist neighbour, and they would sit in the living room together, and they would, probably not living room, but a parlour or whatever, a salon, and they would play through string quartets.
A soiree, in fact.
Yeah, so it has communal, but it's not a big community, it's small, like a family.
An intimate one,
It has that parallel, I think.
Once again, that's a really interesting...
I'm not sure if they thought about that at all, but
No, but if these are resonances we're getting, it's a perfectly legitimate thing to observe it, I think.
Yeah.
You've set me thinking off again on that one, thank you. I keep revisiting that one in my head. It's one of those shows I've sort of carried with me, as portable as a violin, you see. Yes, I may have to give my brain a bit of an old almond oiling and then see if it comes up smiling.
Well, yeah, let me know.
Thank you.
Yeah, it just came to me, those thoughts.
Well, and they genuinely have got me excited, because actually I hadn't considered them at all, and I genuinely think they're really interesting insights and warranting further thinking. Well, there we are. That was Colin Malloy, and before that you heard Michael Gordon Shapiro giving me their thoughts and takes on how to use a washing machine. And then, of course, before that you heard the conversation I recorded last year with Joe Davis and Georgie Botham, the people behind that show, How to Use a Washing Machine. As you can tell, it was a show I liked very much indeed. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Musical Talk. Do join us again next week when, as always, we'll be presenting you with something completely different. I'm not going to tell you what it is, partly in order not to destroy the surprise, and secondly because I want to leave you wondering as to whether we do have an enormous long-term plan of what episodes we're going to be broadcasting, or whether we just make it up on the hoof a week beforehand. What's going to go out next week, Nick? I don't know. What have you got? Well, I've got this recording. Right, that's what's happening. That would never happen. Or would it? Or wouldn't it? Or would it? Well, anyway, you can continue that kind of nonsense on for hours, but I'm not going to do so. And I'm going to make sure I don't by finishing this episode. And I'm going to do that in the time-honoured tradition of saying goodbye. And having just said it then to explain what I'm going to do it, I'm now going to do it in real time with real meaning. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk edited and presented by Thos Ribbits, Michael Gordon Shapiro and Colin Malloy. Copyright Musical Talk 2020. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes. And follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. The microphone is now on, so what I'd like to... It doesn't matter if we slow it halfway through, I intend to, by the way. All adds to the oral pleasure. Would you mind giving me a very quick level each? I've got a little gauge here, so I do spend some of my time looking at this rather than you two, and so I'm sorry for that. You do see the top of my magnificent bald head. Would you care to just tell me what you had for breakfast? In a conversational tone.
I had 2 slices of brown toast with Lurpak lightly salted.
That is a level of detail I find impressive.
Thank you.
What was your salt intake this morning?
I had toast as well, but with no butter, just with jam. Jam was straight
Direct jam?
Yeah.
I say. Yeah. 2 different worldviews, I see. Perhaps reflecting the disciplines of writing and composing.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I will look at this, I will move it around. It's if people come in, as long as the man with the megaphone doesn't walk through, we're fine. And that's perfectly reasonable. Right, the way I like people to start, if that's okay, is if you could give me your names, the name of the show, somebody must say that, and your involvements in it, and then we'll just take a conversation from there. I record as live, but if you find you've libelled your cast, or your family, even worse, can we just not include that? I'll edit that out. So I do edit, and we can roll back and find a new sentence to start from.
Great.
Is that agreeable?
Yeah.
Lovely. Brilliant. So, it's very much feel comfortable. Who would like to go first?
After you can go first.
Okay.
Yeah.